Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth in our series about debunking Jewish stereotypes. Before I begin tonight, I want to make one quick announcement. I'm really glad you're here tonight, but if you feel like doing this again tomorrow night, a colleague of mine is speaking at the JCC tomorrow night for IRP, for retired professionals. His name is Saeed Khan. He's a friend and colleague of mine from Wayne. And he is going to be speaking. He's going to be delivering the IRP's annual Kirsch lecture.
It's tonight.
It's tonight?
Yes.
I thought it was tomorrow night. Oh, you're kidding. I really wanted to hear that. All right, never mind. Forget it. Well, let me put it this way. Thank you for coming to hear me instead of my friend and colleague Saeed Khan. Who would schedule me and Saeed the same time? Why would anybody? Okay. No offense to IRP, a wonderful organization. We were here first. So, all right. Well, I was going to say that it's a great topic, and never mind. All right. This is what he's been talking about lately. I'm sure he'll talk about it again. All right. Let me just gather myself, and let's start that again. All right. So forget that. Let's just dive right into it, shall we? So this evening we're going to make a little bit of a transition, because up till now in the series, in our first three, we've dealt with stereotypes, with myths about Jews that are old, that really date back to antiquity. These are medieval and even ancient stereotypes about Jews that are based largely in religious and Christian ideas. But today we're going to make a transition from these earlier religious-based stereotypes to more modern, secular, political stereotypes. And the one we're going to look at this evening is, well, it's actually a dual stereotype, or it's one stereotype with two parts. All Jews are communists. All communists are Jews. Now, I worded this title very deliberately and very specifically to make the following point, because, like I say, this is a single stereotype, but has two separate components. So, as we shall see, the origin of all Jews are communists and all communists are Jews, the origin's the same. The origins of those two phrases, those two notions, is the same. But the challenge in challenging those notions is not the same. One is more difficult than the other. So we have this common stereotype, but each side of each element, each component of the stereotype resonates a little bit differently, as we shall see. Now, like I said, this is a modern thing. I think it's useful, since we're going to be using this evening words like socialist, communist, Bolshevik, Marxist, different examples of political radicalism. I thought it would be useful right at the beginning just to briefly define these terms, because oftentimes we use them interchangeably, and in some ways there is an overlap between what they mean, but they do refer to different things, and in our context this evening, the subtle differences between them are important. So let me briefly define. Socialism is an economic philosophy. Socialism means public control of the means of production. It's a term coined by, among others, by Karl Marx, although he wasn't the first to use it. Public control of the means of production is basically a way of saying no private property. We all own and control everything together. It's more than anything else, it's describing how an economy works. So socialism is an alternative to capitalism, which is private control of the means of production of the economy. And both of those, capitalism and communism, were alternatives to feudalism, which is an earlier medieval economic organization. Now, socialism came to denote a particular political outlook and a political party, like Social Democrats or Revolutionary Socialists. And that makes sense because this economic outlook eventually had political ramifications as well. In order to implement it and achieve it, it was necessary to have control of the government, and that's why we have socialist parties. Now, communism, although it shares in common with socialism this notion of public control, in some sense, communism is a more specific version of it. Communism is more political ideology than economic ideology. Communism, this was a term coined specifically by Karl Marx, a person we will return to this evening. Communism refers to a particular form of government This is government by a group known as the industrial proletariat, the working class. But even more specifically than that, it describes a particular way in which the working class takes over, typically through some kind of upheaval and revolution. It refers to the creation of workers' councils, which were known as Soviets. And it's describing a political system. So socialism and communism are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although the way we use them, we tend to refer to communism almost interchangeably with communist states. Or we might say the kibbutz was a communist form of organization. Really, strictly speaking, the economy of the kibbutz was socialist. The administration of the kibbutz was communist. I'm being specific. I'm a little bit splitting hairs, but that's okay. And then we have the word Bolshevik. Now, Bolshevik is an even more specific version of all of this because Bolshevism was a specific form of communism. Within the Russian Communist Party, there was the majority and there was the minority faction. And one were the Bolsheviks, the other were known as the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks were the more radical version of Russian communism. That's how specific it gets. Now, the one term we can use, the one umbrella term we can really use to describe all of these, socialism, communism, Bolshevism, we can really subsume all these terms under the banner of Marxism, because Karl Marx is in many ways, if not responsible for all of them, he's the one who's most closely associated with all of them. So Marx was a socialist. Marx was a communist, although it would be anachronistic to call Marx a Bolshevik because Marx was not Russian, he was German, and Marx lived and died before there was such a thing as Bolshevism. So they have these common political aims in mind. They also have this economic program as well. And as long as we're talking about different forms of radicalism, we have one that in some ways is very different called anarchism. An anarchist is someone who believes in no government. Now, you have different kinds of anarchists. You have your popular anarchists. That's sort of the people who live out in the woods and think government shouldn't exist and refuse to pay taxes. That is a very well, I don't want to insult anybody, but that's a very well, a primitive form of anarchism. The real anarchists, the anarcho-syndicalists, these were people who believed that although there was no formal or elected or appointed government, that each individual governing himself or herself, the sum total of that would be a form of collective government. It would just be handled individually. So in some sense, anarchism was the opposite of communism, although the outlook of the anarchist, in an odd and ironic way, was much closer to the communist than it was to the capitalist. Capitalism, even though they believe in individual ownership of property, capitalists did see the necessity of a society, a community, laws, regulations in order for it to work. Anarchists saw no need for any of that. Anarchists were basically counting on human instinct and human character, human desires, basically to govern everything, to manage everything. Now, all of these are these are all very radical forms of politics, and it so happens that, well, in the emergence of every single one of these movements, every single one of these currents, there were prominent Jews associated with all of them. There's no question about that. Now, why that was, we'll come back to. But that has to be clear from the outset tonight. Because we're talking about this notion, all Jews are communists, all communists are Jews. Yes, it's a stereotype. Yes, it's an exaggeration. But it would be equally just as much hyperbole to say no Jews were communists, or there were no prominent Jews represented among all of these. That, of course, is also false. Yes, there is no question. There is no question. So we have to find the actual situation between those two things. And you see on your handout, I made a little photo array for you. I downloaded a bunch of pictures. Believe it or not, this is a small sample of prominent Jews who were involved in these radical political movements. So instead of identifying some of these faces, I think will be familiar to you, but for those who are not, I made a little key below. But trust me, every single one, even if they're not that well known today, 100 years ago, every single one of these individuals was well known, not only in their own country, but pretty much worldwide, or at least in Europe and North America. These were well-known, front-page individuals. Everything they did and said was news. These were people who were promising to change the world in some very drastic ways, and each one, at some point, really was poised to change the world. And that's really one of the reasons why this stereotype is very powerful. Because depending who you were, if you embraced the same beliefs as these radical politicians, these radical intellectuals, you loved them. They were your kind of secular savior or secular messiah. They were going to make the world better for you and for everyone. If you disagreed with them, these people were terrifying. They were promising to do things that were going to destroy your life, destroy society as you know it. And for this reason, this is one of the reasons why, as Jewish stereotypes go, as we look back on these stereotypes, this is the one which really in some ways had the most powerful and profound implications. Because the notion that all Jews are communists, and we'll come back to this too, it translated into a very practical consequence. We all know that about 90 years ago, or 80 years ago, during the 1920s, a decision was made in this country to more or less end Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. Now, the reason for that was not entirely driven by a notion, a belief that many of these immigrants, if not most, if not all, were communist revolutionaries, but that was a big part of it. That anti-Jewish immigrant legislation most likely would not have happened without this particular stereotype. And we all know the consequences of that legislation were absolutely disastrous for us. So this is a stereotype that had tremendous impact. Okay. Now, in tracing the origins, where do we begin? I would suggest we begin in the year 1848. In 1848, this is one of those years, maybe the significance of that year is known to some of you, but I'm going to tell you what it is. In 1848, all across Central Europe, there were a series of revolutions known as the Revolutions of 1848, because they couldn't come up with a more creative title than that. The problem is, you know, the French Revolution, they called the French Revolution because it was in one country. And so was the American Revolution. And so was the Russian Revolution. But the revolutions of 1848 were all across Central Europe, which at the time was made up of dozens of individual German states. So you couldn't tie it to a country, so it was just the revolutions. Now, these revolutions were revolutions against an old regime, kings, sovereigns, a feudal society, hereditary privilege, and the revolutionaries themselves were very radical. But the radicalism they were bringing was none of the radical things I had mentioned before. What made the leaders of these revolutions radical is they were liberals. Now, today, liberal is not radical. In fact, today, liberal is very mainstream. I mean, liberal is not even as radical as progressive, which is a little bit more. But liberal is certainly not socialist, and it's certainly not communist or any of these things. But liberalism in 1848 in Central Europe, this was a major radical position to have. And every one of these revolutions, and there were dozens of them, in dozens of cities, the aim of these revolutions was to depose a hereditary regime. And to eliminate hereditary privilege, like the privileges of nobility, the privileges of the church, the privileges of guilds, and replace them with a liberal state and society based on individual rights, based on all the basic civil rights that we have in our own Constitution. Basically, these revolutions were trying to mimic or reinvent or apply the French and American revolutions to these old-fashioned Central European states. Now, why are they important for our story tonight? Because the most significant of these revolutions took place in Vienna, And the leader of the revolution of 1848 in Vienna was a young Hungarian-born Jewish doctor whose name was Adolf Fischhoff. He's second from the left on the top row. Fischhoff was the leader of the most important of these revolutions. In fact, there was a point during that particular revolution in Vienna where the Emperor of Austria, Vienna was his capital, Emperor Ferdinand, he abdicated. He left, and the empire was being run by a revolutionary committee called the Committee on Public Safety that was presided over by Adolf Fischhoff. So there was about a year at the end of 1848 and the beginning of 1849 where the entire Habsburg monarchy, which was one of the largest states in Europe, was being run by a Jewish revolutionary. And from this fact, there emerged a stereotype. There emerged a notion: all Jews are revolutionaries. All important revolutionaries are Jews. There was, from 1848 on, there were some who would equate radical revolution, in this case liberal revolution, with Jews. All Jews are Fischhoff. That's only half the story. What makes this particular story so interesting is these revolutions did not succeed. They failed. Within a year or two, they were all defeated, and the reason they were defeated is that the powers that be in Central Europe, Prussia, which later became Germany, and the Habsburgs, they were able to recoup their armies and defeat these revolutions, and the reason they were able to do that is because of the financial support of a single Jewish family, the Rothschilds. And so, once these revolutions were defeated, there emerged a second stereotype: all Jews are counter-revolutionary. All Jews are radical conservatives. All Jews are reactionary. So from 1848 on, if you were someone on the left and you were looking for a reason not to like Jews, all Jews are Rothschild. If you were someone on the political right and you were looking for a reason not to like Jews, all Jews are Fischhoff. So it's odd, I know. It makes no rational sense. It's obviously contradictory. It just depends who you were. Depends which newspaper you were reading. But from this point, after 1848, Jews were the ultimate revolutionaries and Jews were the ultimate counter-revolutionaries. Now, this notion of Jews as counter-revolutionary, it really didn't amount to very much. It didn't crystallize very much into anything dangerous or destructive for Jews. In other words, there's always been the anti-Semitism of the left, but relatively speaking, the anti-Semitism on the left has been relatively benign compared to the anti-Semitism on the right, because the anti-Semitism on the left never had any use for racial ideology, xenophobia, and none of those things. So for our purposes tonight, we're more interested in this notion of Fischhoff as this ultra, this mega, or this transcendent revolutionary figure. Now, like I said, Fischhoff was a liberal. He was not a socialist or a communist or any of those things, but he was the most radical person of his day. What's also interesting about 1848 as kind of an afterthought is that 1848, you know, there was a young journalist who covered some of these revolutions in Central Europe. He was writing for a newspaper called the Rheinländische Zeitung, the Rhineland News. He was actually the editor of that newspaper. His name was Karl Marx. Now, what's very interesting, his mentor was another Jewish, well, I guess a Jewish radical named Moses Hess, who was a socialist, and when he originally was the editor of this newspaper, but the publishers of the newspaper, they said, Moses Hess is way too radical for us, let's hire someone else. Oh, how about Karl Marx? So they made Marx the editor of this newspaper. Now, during the revolution of 1848, he was a journalist covering these, and one of the things he noticed, one of the things that happened in these revolutions is that proponents of liberalism, that we would call middle classes, commercial classes, professionals, at some point, originally they were working together with the working class, but as soon as they were able to secure what they needed, the end of hereditary privilege, the rights of property, in other words, as soon as they could transform their states into liberal states as opposed to feudal states, they basically were no longer interested in helping the working class. And Marx watched this, and this is the moment when he realized that the transition from that older autocratic hereditary feudal world to liberalism is only one step towards real equality and real freedom for all people. It's out of these revolutions that Marx begins to say this revolution was incomplete. We need something more drastic. We need something more sweeping and all-encompassing that's going to help not only educated property people, liberals, but it's going to help working class people as well. And really 1848 is the moment when Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. This is the moment when he really invents communism, as he sees what in his mind were the incomplete results or the incomplete impact of the revolutions of 1848. So as you could see, it's a pretty significant moment. Now, from 1848 on, Europe, at least most of it, eventually begins to move in a more liberal direction, which means hereditary privilege begins to diminish. Countries are going to be run by, and not according to hereditary privilege, but careers open to talent, the people who are most capable. You have elections which, although they're not universal, at least more and more people can vote. You don't have everybody voting until the 20th century. Typically after 1848, I would say most or all white, propertied, educated men could vote, which doesn't really sound that great by today's standards, but by those standards was a major step forward, because previously nobody had a vote. So at least 20% of the population had a vote. A step forward, but certainly there was a ways to go. But the opposition to many of these liberal states came from this growing working class movement. And this is when we get into the age of Marxism, socialism, communism. These movements begin to grow. Now, they have large followings at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, but it's really only at the conclusion of the First World War where we really see, where our story really begins. Because really until the First World War, really until the end of the First World War, there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of organization, there was some negotiation, there was some improvement, there were some labor laws, but we don't have anything in the way of a real bona fide socialist or communist revolution until after the First World War. In fact, the beginning of the First World War was supposed to be the beginning of the revolution, but something very disappointing happened, which in a sense is an important prelude to our story. In 1914, everybody knew that all the countries in Europe were about to go to war against each other. And by this point, there was a working class movement or working class party in almost every country in Europe, other than, well, there was no party in Russia. And the assumption was before the war that if it came to actual war, that these socialist parties, these working class movements would abstain from the war because they would identify more with workers in other countries than they would with the upper oppressive classes of their own countries. That was the expectation. You want to have this war? Great. You're going to have to do it without the working classes. But as soon as the war began, and I mean as soon as the war began, first one and then another socialist party or working class movement said, yeah, I know we're workers, but we're German workers, or we're French workers, or we're English workers, or we're whatever. They all fought with their own country against each other. So it was a low point, which is one of the reasons why the disastrous results, the disastrous impact of that war, which killed a lot of people, and a lot of people needlessly in many ways, it really laid the basis. It weakened all of these states and made possible these actual revolutionary moments. And this is really where the age of socialist and communist revolution begins during the waning years of the First World War. Three revolutions in particular we have. The most famous, of course, is the Russian Revolution in 1917. That was followed by a communist revolution in Germany in 1918 and a communist revolution in Hungary in 1919. Now, when I say communist revolution, it's a little more complicated than that. So let me take them one at a time briefly. And as we go, we'll also be able to point out, well, what did this have to do with Jews? Because when we look at these revolutionary moments, it really clarifies this whole notion, this whole stereotype for us. Okay. The Russian Revolution, the most famous, it turns out the Russian Revolution wasn't one revolution. It was actually two revolutions. There's one that's called, well, it's either called the February or the March Revolution, and there's one that's called either the October or the November Revolution. You're wondering, why couldn't they make up their mind? It had to do with the fact that one of the things that happened in Russia during these revolutions is they switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. Now, what did that mean? You know, this always amazes me. These calendars, these are two Christian calendars that date all the way back to early Christianity. The Julian one, that was the one that was used by Eastern Christians, the Gregorian by Western Christians. The difference between these two calendars is one of them counts century years as leap years, the other one doesn't. So they're only different by 1 day every 100 years. So you're asking, well, how different could they be? 1 day every 100 years? Well, that adds up. After 17, 1800, 1900 years, they were off by 17 or 18 days. That's why, if you know anyone who's Eastern Christian, some of them celebrate Christmas at a different time. There was a difference. So I can't remember which is which, but according to one calendar, it's February and one is March, and one is October and one is November. So I think, just to make it easy, we'll call them the February and October Revolution, unless you want to call them March and November. That works. Either way is fine with me. Two revolutions. The March Revolution was just like 1848. It was a liberal revolution, led by a Russian named Alexander Kerensky, who, and basically he turned Russia for about 6 months into a Western-style liberal country. There were elections, the Jews were emancipated, the Pale of Settlement, that residential restriction on Jews was lifted. Basically, Russia turned into Germany or France or England. And that's the direction it seemed to be going. Everyone was invited to organize political parties. They were going to have a Congress. It was going to be just like a Western country. But as always goes, the war was going very badly. They had to pull out of the war. The economy was collapsing. There were all kinds of social problems. What was known as the provisional government, this liberal regime, wasn't able to solve the problem, any of the problems, which prompted that second October Revolution. And this was led by Lenin and his two henchmen, his two right-hand men, or one of whom was Stalin, one of whom was Trotsky. We'll come back to him in a second. And this was that second revolution, and this was known as the Bolshevik Revolution, because Lenin was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, or the Bolshevik part of the Russian Communist Party. And that second revolution, the first one overthrew the Tsar. It was very popular. It involved everyone. The second one was more of a coup. Basically just removed this liberal regime and began to redefine Russia as a communist country. It's the first step toward the transformation of Russia from Russia into the Soviet Union. And so one of the things that Lenin and his Bolsheviks did, leading the government, was they began to basically replace all forms of administration with local Soviets. Workers' councils began to run everything. Now here's the point. Here's the point. That first revolution was a major change. Removing the Tsar was a big change for Russia. The Tsar was this kind of father figure, was beloved, but it wasn't nearly as radical a change for ordinary people, for individual people, as that second revolution was. Because after that first revolution, if you owned a house, you still owned a house. If you had a job, you owned a business, you still owned a business. After that second revolution, if you owned a house, you didn't own it anymore. The people owned it. Which means if you had this nice house where you and your family lived, maybe there were 4 or 5 of you, the next week there could be 30 people living there because the people needed the room. Your house was no longer your own. Your property was no longer your own. You're getting a sense that that's a tad more radical than replacing the Tsar with a liberal regime? A change of rights is something very abstract. Fundamental things like housing and property, that's very drastic. And it prompted a much greater sense that this is something very different. And there were many people in Russia, well, the vast majority, who were not Bolsheviks, who were not communists or socialists, who were just ordinary people, their lives during the course of the following months and years were just turned upside down, and many of them didn't like it, and they needed to figure out what had happened. Well, it so happened that, as a convenient explanation, not only convenient, as a readily accessible explanation, Russians had a history of blaming Jews for their problems. And here it's worth mentioning that in the 1890s, actually the 1880s, the Russian secret police had authored this forgery. They'd invented this pamphlet called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I'm sure you've heard of it. But, by the way, this was a complete forgery, but from the time it first appeared in Russia till today, there are lots and lots of people who not only read it, but believe it. If you Google Protocols of the Elders of Zion, not only can you read it online in its entirety, you can read it in like 50 different languages. After 9/11, there was a documentary film made called Protocols of Zion, or Elders of Zion, where a filmmaker in New York walked around and talked to people whose understanding of that event was almost exactly what the protocols said. So what was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Well, the word protocol means minutes, like minutes of a meeting. The Elders of Zion were this group, well, it was this secret Jewish conspiracy. Now, here's the thing. Some people think that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a secret Jewish plan to take over the world. It's not exactly what it was. It was a meeting with this secret Jewish group who were talking about how they had already taken over the world. And in the Protocols, it explains world events in terms of this Jewish conspiracy. It explains present-day situations and older situations. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then we can understand this revolution and this association of the revolution with Jews more easily. What was the French Revolution really about? And you know, conspiracies, it's always about the real truth, not just the truth. The French Revolution was a Jewish conspiracy aimed at destroying the nobility of Europe, beginning in France, to make it possible for Jewish capitalists to take over. That's what the French Revolution really was. What was socialism really about? Socialism was a Jewish conspiracy whose aim was to convince Christian workers to revolt against Christian capitalists, factory owners, so that Jewish factory owners, Jewish capitalists, could take over even more. So the French Revolution was a Jewish conspiracy against a Christian nobility. Socialism was a Jewish conspiracy against Christian capitalists. And all of this, you remember, whenever you're talking about a conspiracy theory, it doesn't have to be true. It only has to sound true. It's the nature of a conspiracy theory. And people who presume the conspiracy to exist in the first place, it doesn't take very much evidence to sustain it. In fact, there was absolutely no evidence, or very little evidence, for any of this. But people believe these conspiracy theories then and now. And not only this one. There are people who believe all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories. Just as an aside, I'll tell you a funny story. I was teaching some undergraduates about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And as a kind of exercise, I said, well, the notion is you can explain anything. The Protocols claim you can explain anything in terms of a Jewish conspiracy. So I said, why don't you just imagine something? Why don't you just invent another Jewish conspiracy for me and tell me how would you explain it? So one of them said, this was my personal favorite, the election of George W. Bush in 2001 was a Jewish conspiracy between Jon Stewart and Lorne Michaels, Saturday Night Live. It was a Jewish comedy conspiracy. Now, it sounds ridiculous and funny, I guess, but if you believe the conspiracy to be there, you will believe it automatically. You don't need any actual evidence. Now, let's come back to Russia in 1917. The country is being turned upside down, and suddenly we have people wondering, how could this happen? Well, many of them, or at least some of them, had read or heard about this Jewish conspiracy. Obviously, this is part of a secret Jewish conspiracy. So they didn't even need any evidence. But the fact of the matter is, right next to Lenin, there was a guy whose name was Trotsky. Lev or Leon Trotsky. Now, Trotsky was his Russian name. His name from birth was Bernstein. He's someone who, as he became more Russian, he really wasn't very much Jewish at all, but in the eyes of critics of the revolution, he was that Jew Trotsky, and in their mind, in the mind of anyone who believed in that conspiracy, Trotsky was the real power and the real voice and the brains behind it. Lenin was a dupe of Trotsky. Ergo, that communist revolution was a Jewish-inspired revolution. Now, it's funny, if you look at your handout, the rabbi of Moscow at the time, the chief rabbi, who knew Trotsky, and he knew Trotsky even before he was Trotsky, this is responding to, he had a sense that Jews were going to sort of pay the price for this notion that Trotsky was responsible for the revolution, and he said, the Trotskys make the revolutions, but the Bernsteins pay the bills. Because the Jews are going to be held responsible for it. Now, that's a well-known story. It recreates itself in some sense 2 more times, in Germany and in Hungary. In both cases, we have countries that were deeply hurt by the war, where the existing regimes were overthrown and replaced by a communist regime, or in Germany, first by a socialist regime that was led by a Jewish social democrat named Kurt Eisner. But the most radical politics, the most radical faction, the German Communist Party, was led, among others, by a young woman whose name was Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg became the face of German communism. And so the Russian Revolution actually succeeded. The other communist revolutions were defeated. And when they were defeated, even when they were being opposed, they weren't being opposed only as communist revolutions. This is the point when oppositions to these revolutions coined a term called Judeo-Bolshevism. This is when they began to think all Jews are Bolsheviks, all Bolsheviks are Jews. But right from the beginning, we can get a sense that this is an erroneous assumption. Why? First of all, and I think this is the most important point, most Jews, the overwhelming number of Jews in Europe, in the world, in any particular country, in any particular city, were not only not communist, they were anti-communist, and they were terrified by these revolutions. One of the oddities is that there was this prevailing stereotype. We saw last time that all Jews are in business. And no one felt more threatened by a revolution like this, a communist revolution that was going to communalize property, than property owners, people in business. Not to mention Jews were tended to be anti-revolution in general. The instability, the chaos, generally didn't work out very well for Jews. So the fact of the matter is, in Russia in 1917, or in Germany in 1918, or in Hungary in 1919, I would estimate probably 95% of the Jews in these places had wanted nothing to do with this revolution. But see, it didn't matter, because the notion was the fact that there was a Trotsky. So that's first. Most Jews weren't interested. But it's the nature of Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, and in Hungary, a Jew the leader whose name was Béla Kun. They all have something in common. Their Jewish identity was virtually non-existent. And I don't just mean they were atheists. That was like step one. They didn't believe in religion at all. They believed that the differences between Jews and non-Jews was an artificial creation of a capitalist and feudalist society. Trotsky saw no difference, and I mean no difference, between himself and Lenin and Stalin or anyone else. The only difference was you were a communist or you were not a communist. In fact, Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg and other Jewish communists had a greater solidarity with other communists, regardless of what their religious affiliation might once have been, than with any other Jews. Don't believe me. Listen to this in the words of Rosa Luxemburg. Look at text number 2. This is a letter she wrote to a communist friend of hers, where she writes, "I have no room in my heart for Jewish suffering. Why do you pester me with Jewish troubles? I feel closer to the wretched victims of the rubber plantations of Putumayo or the Negroes in Africa. I have no separate corner in my heart for the ghetto. Here's the irony. When she was eventually caught and arrested by the opposition to the revolution, she was executed not only as a communist, but as a Jewish communist, even though in her mind, the fact that of her being Jewish was 100% incidental. It was just a coincidence. Same thing with Trotsky, same thing with Bela Kun, the leader of that revolution. But it didn't stop the opponents of these revolutions from clinging to this notion. Look at text number 3. Kurt Eisner, as I mentioned, was one of the leaders of the German Communist Revolution. Originally a social democrat, he became a communist. And in February 1919, this is what a conservative Prussian newspaper wrote about him. Kurt Eisner was among the most evil representatives of the Jews who in recent months have played so marked a role in German history. In the most prominent way, he combined two characteristics of his race: its historical internationalism, which was code word for communism. For Eisner, too, is a foreigner by birth, and it's racially based idle fancy in contrast to German realism. Idealism here also, another subtext for communism. Now, Eisner himself, no connection to the Jewish community, Jewish identity, other Jews, didn't matter. He was the Jewish communist. Similarly, in Hungary. In Hungary, the communist revolution was led by a man named Bela Kun, who was born Bela Cohn and then Hungarianized his name. He was a disciple of Lenin. And after 1917, Lenin said to him, go to Hungary and do the same thing. So when the war ended and the Hungarian economy and society were in absolute shambles, he led a revolution which was successful for about a year. And that revolution, too, came to be known as a Jewish communist revolution or a Judeo-Bolshevik revolution, even though in Hungary especially, not only were most Jews involved in business, property owners, Hungary was the country where Jews had made the most money. It was the most affluent Jewish community per capita in the world. Even more, in 1919, it was the most affluent Jewish community per capita that had ever existed. They did very well. Why would they want a communist revolution? Most Hungarian Jews were against it. Many were ruined by it. Didn't matter. It was a Jewish revolution. But opponents of that revolution, they saw Bela Kun, who, by the way, wasn't strictly Jewish. He was of Jewish origin. He had Jewish grandparents. He hadn't been Jewish for 2 generations, but he was still Bela Kun the Jew. You know, same way that Disraeli was seen as Jewish. And in 1921, a book was written by him, a French book by two French anti-communists, French conservatives, that was called Quand Israël est roi, When Israel is King. This is text number 3. And this is looking at the long sweeping history of Hungary for the last 1,000 years. After the dynasty of the Arpad, the original Hungarian, dynastic family from the 10th century. After Saint Stephen, their patron saint, and his son, and the Anjous and the Hunyadis and the Habsburgs, there was a king of Israel in Hungary. Today, a new Jerusalem was growing up on the banks of the Danube. It emanated from Karl Marx's Jewish brain and was built by Jews upon a foundation of very ancient ideas. Now, one of the things this harkens back to is Karl Marx, too, let us not forget, he was born Jewish, but he was converted by his parents, who had also converted to Christianity at a young age. And Marx was the original, want nothing to do with religion. You see the point here is you have these individuals of Jewish origin who are prominent figures in the development of this ideology and this movement, but they didn't see themselves as Jews. In fact, each one of these, Karl Marx, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Bela Kun, they saw their Jewish background and Jewish heritage more as an impediment than anything else that they tried to cut themselves off from. So the upshot is, by the early 1920s, there was this sense, first in Europe, that being Jewish and being communist were somehow the same. Now, how is it that people were buying into this? Let me illustrate it by giving you the following statistic. I think it'll make it easier to understand. And this statistic comes from interwar Poland. Now, interwar Poland in the 1920s and the 1930s, prior to the Holocaust, was the largest Jewish community in the world. It's estimated in Poland until 1940, there were about 3.3 million Jews, of which 5,000 were communist. 5,000 out of 3.3 million I did the math at home. I believe that's 0.16%, or maybe 0.016%, a really minuscule number. So if only 5,000 out of 3 million were Jews, were communists, why would there be this notion that all Jews are communists? Well, here's the other figure. In Poland, in all of Poland, which had a population of about 10 million, there were about 20,000 communists. So out of 20,000 communists, 5,000 were Jews. 1/4 of all communists were Jews. You see where this is going? The notion that all Jews were communist is ridiculous if you knew anything about the numbers. But the notion that all communists were Jews, that's a little different. Because there really was an actual statistic which said 25% of communists are Jews. It's just a very small number. But we can also explain that historically and sociologically. The simple fact was, those 20,000 communists, 5,000 of whom were Jews, were drawn not randomly or evenly from the overall population, but from a very specific subset of the overall population. What do I mean by very specific subset? I mean urban, educated, politically to the left, either liberal or maybe progressive. And when you look at that part of the population, the urban, educated, liberal population, then the percentage of Jews becomes a lot more. So in Warsaw, Jews were a much larger part of the population than anywhere else. And Warsaw was one of the focal points of Polish communism. Most of those 20,000 Polish communists lived in Warsaw, which also had the largest Jewish community. It was also the focal point of urban, educated, middle-class, left-leaning Jews. Now, it still doesn't mean there's no most or all here, but at least it's a little bit more plausible. It also explains that when this notion transplanted itself from Europe to America, which it did in the early 1920s, it seemed more plausible. And here's where our story really gets a little more personal and comes home to roost. Because in the United States in the early 1920s, after the First World War, we have a surge of anti-communism. We also have probably the most support for communism ever in the history of our country was probably around 1920. You ever saw the movie Reds with Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton, Jack Nicholson? You know, that's about Jack Reed, who was a prominent communist, a prominent American communist. That's about as good as it got. And because communism, it was still minuscule and it still accomplished next to nothing. There was going to be no communism in this country for a lot of reasons. But it promoted it elicited a backlash. There was a real fear of communism, and not only a fear of communism, but this is the point when there were, well, American anti-communists who began to buy into the idea of equating Jews and communists. In other words, what we've called Judeo-Bolshevism comes to America more than anything else through a single individual whose name was Henry Ford. You knew we had to mention Henry Ford tonight. Henry Ford, well, he was the most powerful man in America in the 1920s, but he also was the leading voice of anti-communism / anti-Bolshevism. He was anti-immigrant. I mean, he was an anti-communist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic. He also was an isolationist. He tried to prevent the United States from entering World War I. In fact, in an odd sort of way, he worked with a Jewish communist named Rosa Schwimmer during the war to try to keep the United States out. But he was the one who believed that the United States shouldn't be involved in Europe, and he was the one, probably more than anyone else, who pushed through the anti-Jewish immigrant legislation. He was a powerful man with powerful views who, in 1922, they asked him if he'd run for president in 1924. He said, "I have no political experience." "But that shouldn't matter. You're a businessman. You'll know how to run the country." He didn't do it. He didn't do it, and probably in retrospect, well, we cut a break there. But he was still a very powerful man, and he also understood that power wasn't only about wealth, wasn't only about connection, but it was also about information, something we'll return to when we talk about Jews in the media in the last session. But he purchased a newspaper in Dearborn called the International Jew, called the Dearborn Independent, and he did two things. One of the first things he did is he commissioned an English translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book or pamphlet that he absolutely loved. It was like the Bible for him. Well, other than the Bible, it was like the Bible for him. And one of the first essays he wrote as the publisher of the Dearborn Independent, he wrote in 1920, called The International Jew. And look at text 4. I just want to read a little bit of it. This is from one section of this much longer essay, which, by the way, you can read the whole thing online if you want. The Soviet, meaning the Workers' Council, is not a Russian but a Jewish institution, nor is it the invention of Russian Jews of the present time, a new political device which has been set up as a vehicle of the ideas of Lenin and Trotsky. It is of ancient Jewish origin. He's taking the argument to the next level. He's saying that communism / Bolshevism is not a product, something Jews invented out of present circumstances. It is hardwired into the Jewish way of life from antiquity. A device which the Jews themselves invented to maintain their distinctive racial and national life after the conquest of Palestine by the Romans. Modern Bolshevism, which is now known to be merely the outer cloak of a long-planned coup to establish the domination of a race, Jews, immediately set up the Soviet form of government because the Jews of all countries who contributed to Russian Bolshevism had long been schooled in the nature and structure of the Soviet. The Soviet appears in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion under the ancient name Kahal. Kahal is the Hebrew term, the rabbinic term for community. Kahal, in Jewish history, Kahal is the official name of the official Jewish community. And what Henry Ford is saying, that the Jewish community, as it's always existed, is just basically a prelude to the communist Soviet. See, he's taken this argument, he's taking this notion, this stereotype, and just pressing it much deeper. He's taking the conspiracy theory and just going crazy. Note how he cites no evidence. In the 17th protocol, here he's quoting the protocols, this passage occurs, even now our brothers under obligation to denounce apostates of their own family or any person known to be opposed to the Kahal. When our kingdom comes, it will be necessary for all subjects to serve the state in a similar manner. Kingdom comes, in Henry Ford's mind, meant communist revolution. And he goes on to elaborate. Let's just jump down to the last paragraph of this excerpt. The Russian Revolution will go down in history with no such false halo of romance around it as the romance around the Kahal. The world now knows it for what it is. The world will soon know who was the money and whose were the brains that fostered it and from what part of the world the principal impetus came. The Russian upheaval is racial, not political nor economic. It conceals beneath all its false socialism and its empty mouthings of human brotherhood a clear-cut plan of racial imperialism which is not Russian, of which the common sense and interest of the world will speedily stamp out. He saw the war against communism as a war against Jews or Jewish communism. That was the heart and soul of his own anti-Semitism. That's why he wanted to keep Jews out of this country. And Henry Ford was really the one who promoted the notion, all Jews are communists, therefore no Jews can come in, which obviously had disastrous results. Now, Henry Ford had a lot of readers. This Dearborn Independent had a big circulation. I wish I could say it didn't. A lot of people subscribed, not only in Detroit, but all over the country. He had the means to distribute. It was almost like the internet before the internet. He may have been the original social media blogger. Everybody read this, not only in America, but also in Europe. And he had a devoted reader in Europe whose name was Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm not going to blame Henry Ford for Hitler. I'm sure that was not his intention. At no point is he talking about killing Jews. He simply wanted to keep them out of America, keep them in messed up Europe. But Hitler, when he began to think about Jews, he also bought into the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory. he equally equated the two, no question about it. And when Hitler began to think about how to make Germany great again, what to do about Jews in his country, I didn't mean to say it that way, it just sort of came out that way. In his magnum opus, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which he wrote in prison from 1923 to 1925, listen to how he says it. This is text number 5. Never forget that the rulers of present-day Russia are common, blood-stained criminals, that they are the scum of humanity, which, favored by circumstance, overran a great state in a tragic hour. Now this is also very odd because Russia was the absolute enemy of Germany, and here's Hitler talking about Russia as a great state. Slaughtered and wiped out thousands of her leading intelligentsia in a wild bloodlust, and now for almost 10 years have been carrying on the most cruel and tyrannical regime of all time. Furthermore, do not forget that these rulers belong to a race which combines in a rare mixture bestial cruelty and an inconceivable gift for lying, and which today more than ever is conscious of a mission to impose its bloody oppression on the whole world. Do not forget that the international Jew, and remember, Henry Ford's essay was called The International Jew, who completely dominates Russia today, regards Germany not as an ally, but as a state destined to the same fate. In Russian Bolshevism, we must see the attempt undertaken by Jews in the 20th century to achieve world domination. Just as in other epochs they strove to reach the same goal by other, though inwardly related processes, their endeavor lies profoundly rooted in their essential nature. Now, Hitler's application of these ideas were far more demonic and diabolical than Henry Ford's, but the basic assumption is the same. They both saw no difference between Jew and communist. They equated one with the other. Now, fortunately, there were others who saw it a little bit more subtly. And you know, there's an essay written in 1920 called Zionism versus Bolshevism. Now, I didn't put the author here. In this case, I wanted to surprise you with who wrote this. But this is a more sophisticated way of understanding. Here we have an example of an individual who began to differentiate between two things, who began to see that although it looks like all communists are Jews, it certainly is not true that all Jews are communists. So let me read a little bit of it, and then I'll tell you who wrote it. If you wrote it, don't tell anybody, because it's always a nice little surprise, or maybe not, I don't know. This is text number 6. Some people like Jews, and some do not. But no thoughtful man can doubt the fact that they are beyond all question the most formidable and most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. Remember, we talked about anti-Semitism versus philo-Semitism. That's philo-Semitism, singling out Jews for being unusually remarkable. Disraeli, the Jew Prime Minister of England and leader of the Conservative Party, was always true to his race and proud of his origin, said on a well-known occasion, "The Lord deals with the nations as the nations deal with the Jews." At the present fateful period, there are 3 main lines of political conceptions among the Jews, 2 of which are helpful and hopeful in a very high degree to humanity, and a third absolutely destructive. Okay, 3 kinds of Jewish politics. First, there are Jews who, dwelling in every country throughout the world, identify themselves with that country. There are faithful Jews who are citizens, who are loyal to the country. That's one of the good ones. All right? Skip to the next paragraph. These are Jews who say, "I'm an Englishman practicing the Jewish faith." In violent opposition to this sphere of Jewish effort rise the schemes of the international Jews, Jewish communists. The adherents of this sinister confederacy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all, and here he's making this difference, most, if not all of them, have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, down to Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, of impossible equality, has been steadily growing. It played, as a modern writer has so ably shown, a definitively recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution, yada, yada, yada. Skip to the next paragraph. There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and in the actual bringing about of the Russian Revolution by these international Jews, international and for the most part atheistical Jews. It is certainly a very great one. It probably outweighs all other. But the author here is willing to say that even though it's true that there are so many prominent Jews among the communists, he concedes the fact that most Jews are not interested. The Jews who are interested are Jews who are not very Jewish at all. He makes that distinction and was one of the first to be able to do so. The author's name was Winston Churchill. He was the English colonial secretary. And by the way, the third kind of Jewish politics is Zionism, which he also likes, which he also spoke about, at least initially, very favorably. Now let me conclude this evening by looking at one of the first responses to all of this, one of the first Jews who encountered this dual stereotype and spoke out directly against it. His name was Lucian Wolff, and in 1921 he wrote a book called The Myth of the Jewish Protocols in World Affairs, or The Truth About the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He was one of the first who said, that Elders of Zion thing, it's just not true, it's unsubstantiated. And he wrote this little text against it, which is still available on Amazon. It's a great read, by the way. I should tell you before we read this that he convinced nobody. He changed no one's mind, because people who didn't believe in the protocols, they didn't need to have their minds changed. People who did believe it accepted the conspiracy theory to be true, and their minds were just nailed to that spot. What does Lucian Wolff write? This is text number 7. These writers of the protocols were the final artificers of the bogey as we know it, Trotsky being represented in their pages as the conscious instrument not only of the Jewish rabbinate and Jewish finance, but also of the secretly Judaized Masonic lodges. Here we get this notion that the Freemason lodges, who were the original radicals of the 18th century, here's where 20th century thinkers begin to look back at those Masonic lodges in 18th century England and Scotland and Germany and say, obviously that was a Jewish invention, which is one of the things the protocol said. The irony being that those lodges didn't allow Jews in. But still a Jewish invention. We need only glance at the leading tenets of the Bolsheviks to realize how stupid all this is. Indeed, and he says it so well, how impossible it is that Bolshevism should find even an appreciable measure of sympathy in the Jewish community. Lenin, Trotsky, and their associates are not only extreme communists, but also avowed atheists. On the other hand, the great bulk of the Jews of Russia are extremely orthodox members of the synagogue who hold in horror every symptom of atheism. To put it succinctly, Lucian Wolff said, none of this makes any sense. If you're going to accuse Jews of something, at least have it make some sense. In his mind, the blood libel was wrong and unsubstantiated, but at least it made, at least it kind of made sense if you believe Jews killed Christ. But even then you have to make an assumption. But Jews orchestrating an atheistic anti-Jewish movement like communism, why? That was the problem he raised. And the upshot of all of this, when we look at the impact, is what this stereotype really tells us, as much or more as any stereotype, is two things. First of all, like I said, most Jews were simply not interested in it, and most Jews were not anti-communist per se. They were either indifferent to it or afraid of it, but they weren't trying to come, they were just trying to stay out of its way. One of the things that many Jews in the Soviet Union, we now know, many Jews in the Soviet Union, they lived under Soviet communism. They went along. It doesn't mean they were avowed and impassioned communists. They were just trying to survive and work the system like everybody else. The other thing, though, I think this tells us, and this really is something I think very important for the moment we're in right now, is the power of a modern conspiracy theory. As soon as you have a statement, all blank are blank, it becomes very potent. And when you have people who buy into it a priori, just because it sounds good or it's going to help explain something, very difficult to change their mind. But we have some experience with this. We as Jews, we have to suffer the consequences of the phrase, all Jews are communists. That worked out very badly for us. If nothing else, we should be a little wary of making those kinds of sweeping assumptions. Because it may be true that in other scary groups, there might be a disproportionate number of a certain kind of individual, but that doesn't mean every one of those, that kind of individual is a part of that group. You got to keep the causality straight. But I'd like to say that this notion is gone, that this notion of all Jews was diffused by the end of the Cold War. It's still around. Just try Googling all Jews are communists, or Google Judeo-Bolshevism. It's almost as prevalent as the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This isn't a stereotype from antiquity. This is a stereotype that's around right now that we continue to combat, and our best fight against it is reality. The fact that most Jews are not and have never been communists. Thank you. Thank you very much.